Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at The Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos Reyes and our regular panelist, Christopher Zander. Our special and very welcome guest is Professor Rebecca Ginsburg. She is the director of the Education Justice Project. Two items before we start. Lo and behold, our producer, Sebastian Mahfood, just announced that we have nonprofit status. And that means for our many very wealthy auditors who give away lots and lots of money, that you can get a tax break. It also means that while some people say they don't hesitate to ask for money, I've never been among their members, so I will ask for money, and as much as $5 would be appreciated. You know as well that we are the voice, unofficial, of the American Solidarity Party, and after our last gubernatorial race here in the state of California, well, how often do you hear this? The campaign had money left over. It was in the high double digits. So you can see that we're wheelers and dealers. That said, let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Professor Ginsburg, can you tell us about the Education Justice Project, how you came to be its director, and of course, what does it offer?
Yes, thank you. It's very wonderful to be here with you today. Thank you for having me on the show. The Education Justice Project is a comprehensive college and prison program, one of about 150 college and prison programs in the United States. We are based at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and we offer 4-credit courses and extracurricular educational opportunities to men who are incarcerated at a nearby state prison. It's called Danville Correctional Center. We've been doing this for 11 years, and in the process have grown from the prison itself to offering programs and activities in the community. Those include a reentry guide. We produce the only comprehensive reentry guide for the state of Illinois. We also, and reentry refers to the process by which people leave prison and get adjusted to life on the outside. We produce a reentry guide for people who are getting deported to Mexico or Central America. We offer scholarships to formerly incarcerated people, to the family members of formerly incarcerated people as well, and host a lot of events on campus and the community. Our aim is to try to promote a critical understanding of incarceration and reentry and the criminal justice system more broadly.
You have a ambitious agenda. You didn't mention the prison. It's Danville, right?
That's right, yes.
And during the Vietnam War period, there were any number of war resistors who, for their crime of resisting the unjust war in Vietnam, went to Danville. So that's when I first became aware of it.
Danville, it wouldn't have been our prison because Danville Correctional Center, where we are based, was built in 1985.
Ah.
But I'm sure there are other Danville prisons. In fact, I know that there's a prison in Indiana with the same name, and there must be others.
Ah, that could be it. Favorite name for prisons. Well, Education Justice Project. I'm sure that Mario and Christopher would like to ask you questions about what justice is. So I'm going to turn things over to them.
Well, good morning, Professor Ginsburg. This is Mario. I have a question. I learned that you were Dr. Hanning's student at one time. So I'm curious about the question of justice. What do you see as the foundation of justice?
Sure, and I was Jim Hannick's student, and I would consider myself very, very lucky to have been so. And I can't tell you how many times as a college professor now, I try to channel him to be more clear and smart in my communications with students and my colleagues. He was an excellent, excellent teacher. I'm sure he still is.
I've taped all that.
I hope you have. Mario, you asked me about justice. And I want to say a couple of things about that. The first is that the word justice in our name, Education Justice Project, does refer, of course, to the concept of justice, which I will return to in a minute. But it refers, secondly, to it's there to provide indication to people who come across our name that we are involved in criminal justice matters, which is to say that for our allies and organizations and individuals that we work with, the environment that we move in, the term justice is a kind of a clue that this organization is concerned with people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And we wanted to convey that in our name, not in a super direct way. We didn't want to say program to teach incarcerated people at Danville Correctional Center, but we wanted to make it obvious to those in the know that we were involved in some way with people who had been, as they're often called these days, justice-involved individuals or system-involved individuals. So that's one reason the word justice appears there. But it does appear, as your question suggests, for another reason, which is that we want to encourage people who think about the work of providing higher education to incarcerated individuals and expanding access to higher education for formerly incarcerated individuals. We want to encourage them to think about this in terms of justice. So maybe a good starting off point is to think about the classic definition of justice as just simply ensuring that people get their due. And we typically think about that in contexts of harm or conflict or scarcity, that wanting to ensure that the parties involved get what is due to them, get what we as a society owe them within that particular situation. And so it's very situation specific, very much dependent on the circumstances of any particular act of harm or wrongdoing. But I do believe that there are some guiding principles that I know I find myself drawn to these when I think about how we as a society need to ensure in specific situations that people are getting what is owed to them. And those principles would include, but not be limited to, compassion, equity, and thirdly, a commitment to addressing all the harms that are revealed by a certain conflict or certain act of violence. And that last bit, the commitment to addressing all the harms that are revealed in an act of violence or an act of conflict, that's not my idea. That comes from, oh my goodness, what is his name? The philosopher who has done so much work on restorative justice, and his name is escaping me. I didn't even write it down because I know him so well. So
that's all right. It'll come to you.
It will come to me
later, next
week. Howard there. So let me say that again. I'm going to say that again because I know you can take this over. That last concept, the idea that it's important to address all the harms that are revealed in an act of violence or in a situation of conflict, that's not original to me. That comes from the philosopher Howard Zare, who's very well known for the work he's done in restorative justice. I find it a very compelling idea.
Could you spell that last name for us, please?
Sure.
Rebecca.
There is Z-E-H-R.
Z-E-H-R. All right.
Z as in zebra.
I'm glad you mentioned him. Christopher, anything else on justice as we get started here?
Well, yeah, I certainly concur in the definition of justice. I guess I would be interested in more specifics, like, for instance, assuming you're talking about addressing the whole panoply of things, in terms of actual act of crime, how does the concept of justice work? I mean, it seems like you would say that you have to address more than simply the isolated act of crime. You have to address it in its larger context. I don't know if I'm misreading you, but if you could maybe, for instance, like Grand Theft Auto, how would you see that crime should be addressed justly?
Sure. I appreciate that question, and I want to start by tackling the word crime, because you'll notice when I described my conception of justice, I didn't use the word crime, and that was very purposeful. I spoke of conflict or harm or violence or wrongdoing. And I'm careful not to use the word crime, and I'm certainly careful not to use the word criminal, because I understand both of those to be social constructs that make it harder for us to really get a handle on what's happening. The issue is that someone or something has been hurt, that there is a loss, that there is a harm, that there is violence. That's what is of concern to us, and by us I mean society. It's not that there is a crime per se, because as we all know, what is a crime at any given moment changes, right? Marijuana possession, I guess, is a really timely example here in Illinois anyway, because we just legalized, I think, the possession of marijuana and the sale of certain kinds of marijuana. But, 6 months ago, you would have been arrested for it. So when I think about how ideally I would like to see societies, institutions respond to serious acts of wrongdoing, such as stealing somebody's car. That's the example you provided. Let me give you first the answer that is moderately satisfactory to me, and that in fact I would be very happy if it were implemented. And then I'll give you the example that would make me very, very happy. Is that okay, Sebastian?
That's fine, yeah.
Sure.
That's
so
Christopher. That's Christopher.
I'm
sorry.
Interchangeable. That's Christopher.
I thought there was a little bit of a hesitation in this response. Excuse me, Christopher. So if I can proceed with that. So I spoke about Howard Zare. He's considered one of the grandfathers, if you will, of restorative justice. And from a restorative justice framework, and this happens in some jurisdictions, so it's not something I'm pulling out of thin air. There are places in which these processes are implemented. If Peter steals a car, if Peter steals John's car, instead of Peter being subject to criminal sanctions through the court system as we know it today, Peter and John and other people who are identified as having the need of being restored by the act of taking the car will be invited to participate in a series of convenings that will be facilitated by someone who is trained as a restorative justice practitioner. And in the course of those proceedings, John, who had the car stolen from him, will talk about what the loss meant, how much it cost him, the impact it had on his family members or his business or whatever. And maybe those family members and those business associates will also be invited to come and share and to talk about their loss. And then Peter, the person who took the car, will be invited to talk about why he took it and certainly invited to speak about what he's learning from the process when he encounters John face to face, what his emotional response is, how does this make him think about how he might make different choices in the future, and so on and so on. This process takes place over a series of meetings. It might take 3 or 4 months for restorative justice process to be concluded, and it will be up to the individuals who are concerned, typically with some court-imposed limitations, to decide what a fitting response to the act of wrongdoing is. So I think it was John, whose car was stolen, might decide that he wants Peter simply to return the car, or that he wants Peter to do some work for him, or that he wants Peter to keep the car because now he realizes that the reason Peter took it is because he needs a car to go to work, but to work off some kind of payment plan. The goal of the restorative justice process is to ensure that John, the person whose car was taken, feels restored in the end, feels that he is back to where he was. Now, of course, not literally, but figuratively speaking, that he should feel restored and should feel whole, and that all participants should feel heard. So that's one example of a process that takes into account not just the harm itself, but the larger context in which the harm took place. That's restorative justice. What I'm even more attracted to is what some practitioners call transformative justice, which asks the question not I'm getting my people mixed up, not just what does John need to feel restored, but what needs to happen in this particular situation such that all the harms are addressed and this situation, this conflict, this harm is not likely to happen again. And in that situation, it might not just be the case that John is called to sit in the circle and to participate and to share, and the family members that also experienced John's loss, but Peter's family members as well. So Peter's the person who took the car, the people who can help us understand the situation from which Peter acted, the motivations and the needs that drew him to take the car, to steal the car. And the goal would not simply be, as I say, helping John feel whole, but addressing the question, what needs to change here such that Peter doesn't feel the needs that the whatever compelled him to steal the car. And I guess I'm using the word need. It may be a financial need. It may be a mental health need, right? It may be a social need. But those questions would be asked in a transformative justice process. That was a very long answer, but I hope it helps with the specifics that you were looking for.
Well, on this program, we're against sound bites. We're against sound bites. Creative. So don't mind a longer answer. But when you give a good answer, it leads to more questions. So, Christopher and Mario?
I just want to follow up on that, if I may. I'm somewhat familiar with restorative justice. Back in my journalist days, I did a number of articles on restorative justice, and I'm very sympathetic to it, having also lived for over 20 years in a prison town and seeing the effects of prison culture on the town in which we live. So that was a special interest to me.
Tehachapi.
You're not supposed to mention it. I was trying to be coy. Okay.
You know, at the end of a Bogey film, Humphrey Bogart film, Bogey says, "She's going to Tehachapi."
Yeah, I know about the Charles Colombier, a mutual friend of ours, used to call me, and he'd say, "May I speak to the warden?" So
that shows you the kind of people we hang with.
Yes, right, yeah.
Strange bunch.
But anyway, I'm very sympathetic to it. But my memory of the whole restorative justice, not touching on transformative justice, but of course I'd like you to include that in your answer. My memory of the restorative justice ideas was that it basically applied to nonviolent crimes. So, I mean, and there's various levels, obviously, as you know, of violent crimes and reasons why people commit violent crimes. Some seem actually very cold-blooded, such as the man who wants to knock off his wife so he can get her inheritance or something of that sort. What do you do? How does this apply to particularly violent crimes which seem to be motivated by not even motivated by passion, but by cold calculation?
Thank you for the question. You're right that traditionally restorative justice principles or processes have been applied to nonviolent offenses, but in recent years we've seen their use applied in situations of violent crimes as well. And there have been even a couple of cases in the United States where the court has granted permission for parties in a homicide to use restorative justice principles. I think that's an encouraging trend. I don't think there's any reason why we can't apply the same practice of sitting back and listening and giving space to people involved in a set of violent circumstances that we do to people who are involved in so-called nonviolent. And as you acknowledged, there's a gradient. What we consider violent one day is not considered nonviolent in another state or in another time. But I also want to take up this notion of cold-blooded acts or calculated acts. I work with many. I have worked, and I've been doing college and prison work, I should say, since the 1990s. I got my start at a college and prison program at San Quentin when I was a graduate student in the Bay Area, and then I've been with the Education Justice Project, leading it since 2005, 2006. So I'm speaking from a couple of decades, which seems strange to say, years of worth of experience and of engagement with people who are incarcerated. And I will say that most students in college and prison programs are serving long sentences for serious crimes. And that's due to the nature of the criminal justice system in the United States. Most people who are incarcerated in the United States do not have a GED or a high school diploma. And because there are such long waiting lists to get those qualifications within American prisons, people serving short sentences, typically, they're lucky if they can get a GED. They're not going to have the time to get into the college programs that exist. So the folks that find their way into those college programs are those that stick around long enough to get the GED from the prison and then to take the college courses. And for that reason, most of the people that we serve or that we work with, most of our students are serving very long sentences and have been convicted of crimes like homicide. So those are the people actually I know best. I don't have as much familiarity with folks who are inside for drug possession or, just a DUI or something like that. And many of them were once described as cold-blooded and calculated. In fact, when you spoke, Christopher, I was thinking about one of our students who was formerly on death row, but because Illinois abolished death row, about 8 years ago now, he is currently serving a life sentence. And he was described by the judge and many, many other people as unredeemable and cold-blooded and vicious. And all of those adjectives that many of us traditionally describe to folks that we want to... sorry, I'm distracted. Should I stop with all those?
Yeah, you're fine.
We're getting a little background noise, but it's all right. If nobody can do anything to get out the background noise, Sebastian will work on it.
Okay. No, I can't remember what I was saying. I didn't know it was background noise. I thought it was the phones acting up. So, in my experience, human beings are capable of change and of growth and of development, and are good. Human beings are good. In my experience, many, many human beings have been damaged by their circumstances. We talk a lot these days about trauma. That's the catchphrase right now, and resilience. These are new terms to help us understand what people have understood for a long time, which is that life is very difficult for people who are members of vulnerable populations, for people who are poor, for example, for people who come up in families with alcoholic parents or who are abusing drugs, or people who are members of racial minorities, for people who have non-conforming gender identities, that life can be difficult and cruel and that they can be damaged as a result of what they experience in the world. And we know as well that some people come into the world damaged emotionally, physically, and that people who are damaged are capable of tremendous acts of violence. One of the expressions that we hear a lot in my world is hurt people hurt people. Now, of course, it's not the case that all hurt people hurt people. In fact, most hurt people don't hurt people. But I find, my experience leads me to believe that when we encounter folks who have committed acts of cruelty, of great violence, that maybe seem almost sadistic, that it's not because they're cold-blooded, it's because they've been hurt, and that our response to their pain will, I hope, in the ideal world of which I'm speaking, consist in our being very curious about what hurt them and very sincere in our desire to want to heal that hurt.
This is a really profound consideration that you're raising. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you do that's so important is that you work it out as best as it can be in the case of this person, that person, the other person. I'd like to offer, and you mentioned that your very definition of justice was a classic one, giving each person his or her due. I'd like to mention another classic consideration. And again, it's up to people such as yourself to see what application can be made. And this is something that comes from Aristotle, and St. Thomas Aquinas oftentimes uses it as well. It's the distinction between the transitive dimension of an action and the intransitive dimension of the action.
Mm-hmm.
And way to think about it is, certain verbs are transitive verbs and they have a direct object. And other verbs are intransitive. They don't have a direct object. But the way it works is that ordinarily actions have both a transitive dimension and an intransitive dimension. So you could talk about how the action of, let's say, bullying affects the person who is being bullied. At the same time, you could talk about how the action of bullying affects the person who is doing the bullying. And as far back as Plato's Republic, moral philosophers have argued that as horrific as the transitive dimension of an action can be in its consequences, as horrific as they can be, the intransitive dimension is even more central to moral analysis. Just for a quick, maybe too quick application, if I have one of my kids going to school and I'm called in for a parent-teacher conference and the teacher begins by talking about the bullying that's going on in grade 7, I might be thinking, oh my God, my kid is getting bullied. I want to hear about this. But if the teacher then says, I'm sorry to say that your son is the bully, I think I'd be much more hurt by learning that my son was the bully than that he had been bullied.
Yes.
And I think it's crucial that we keep in mind these two dimensions and that we take seriously the question of the intransitive dimension of say, an act of violence. So I mentioned that as a contextual point, but that's rather a background point. We have one of our regular listeners, and we invite them all to suggest points for discussion. And I just want to read you one of these today. I didn't have it on our list of questions that we all shared in advance because it came in too late. But here it is. This is from Shane Ian Hoffman, who's very active in the Solidarity Party. He writes this: one area of criminal justice that is of particular interest is the role of the system in entrenching families in poverty. Fines and fees can't be paid, so they incur interest. You lose your license, so you can't drive to work. You go to jail, you can't get a job because you have a record. You may not be able to find a place to live because of your record. Maybe you lose your job because you can't get time off to go to court. The system is rigged, he says, to put people into poverty and make sure they never get out. Any experience of that pattern, Rebecca?
Yes. And I first wanted to say thank you. I wasn't familiar with the transitive versus intransitive distinction, and that's very helpful, and I'm going to look that up. Yes, in response to your caller's question, the reader, what do you call him? Listener.
Well, he might give $5. You don't know. So.
In response to your donor's question.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We see frequently, and the research and the data suggests too, that incarceration in particular and criminal justice involvement in general tends to be very costly financially for those who are involved, not just the individual, but also the family members, such that it's hard to recover from even a single involvement. even a single arrest that might result in no charges being filed can produce a cascade of consequences that could result in hardship for an individual, like losing their job or losing housing, for example. And I've heard many stories like this. I do want to think harder about the question, about the word that he used. He said the system is rigged. And while many people that I respect very much do believe that the system is rigged, I don't use that term myself because it suggests a explicit intention to produce these consequences for especially racial minorities and poor people. And I don't think that's the case. I think that it's easier for me to understand this as these policies and these practices as a result of racism, of prejudice against poor people, of a very punitive orientation towards harm and violence based out of fear, for example, against folks that we suspect are capable of doing harm and violence to us, and a high degree of satisfaction and contentment with the results. But those are the factors I see contributing to some of the factors I see contributing to the system operating as it does. I also want to speak of another way in which it's costly to be involved with the criminal justice system. So your caller speaks about the financial implications, like losing a job or losing housing. There's also the social costs. There are also the social costs associated with being caught up with the criminal justice system. It's a funny thing because we've got mass incarceration in this country, what some people call hyper-incarceration, which means that many people are involved. They're incarcerated, they're on parole, they're on probation, they're on electronic monitoring, and yet there's still such a heavy stigma associated with having been incarcerated or having been part of the system. And that stigma, I've heard heartbreaking stories of people getting out of prison, going back to their church and being told they're not welcome.
Yeah.
I find that incredible. I've heard heartbreaking stories of people whose partners, whose spouses, whose husbands, for example, end up being incarcerated, and the family goes to the church, expecting if at all times of their lives, this is a time when they need that community behind them, and being told that they're not welcome. Children who are teased and bullied at school, people who, in jurisdictions where it's landlords have some discretion in deciding on what basis they're going to deny housing, being discriminated against because of their association with loved ones who are incarcerated, or because of the notoriety of a particular offense. The social costs of being caught up for everybody in the orbit who is caught up in the criminal justice system are immense, and something we really need to address as well.
The sorry business of rejection at one's church calls to mind, for me, another important philosophical distinction. Aristotle would not know what to have made of the good thief next to Jesus on the cross. I think Aristotle would say, sorry, too late.
Too late, yes.
Your acts have made you to be a certain kind of person, and the prudent thing to say at this point is you're just sucking up, dude. Whereas Jesus would say, this day you will be with me in paradise.
Right.
And I think one of the things that makes such an extraordinary difference is the real belief in grace, the real belief that God can touch our hearts and transform them. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Just a change of perspective. And once again, I see that we're about 3/4 of the way through our hour. There's never enough time. Mario, in your experiences, widespread, coming from their experiences of Latin America, is the criminal justice system different in any notable way?
Well, it's a very complicated question to answer that. I think it's very different in many ways. So the system in Latin America and most countries is undermined by lack of resources, awareness of what prison ought to be or not ought to be. So there is a variety of reasons why, in some ways, also the system is unjust, using a very general term in many ways. But my observation and my reaction and my question to what Professor Ginsburg is saying, I think, goes to this reflection and question. We was describing the way by which many people react when they have someone or when they learn someone who has been incarcerated and has come back and is being rejected. Or, as I sometimes hear people saying, well, such and such got what he deserved. And he chose that path, and that is what the penalty is. So as if human beings are only made of will and intellect. In other words, you have chosen this bad path, then that the system made you, given you this penalty. So something is missing there, which is, I think, Professor Ginsburg said very well about emotions. Is there anything else that prompts that individual to behave as a bully? Is there anything else other than the way that that person have chosen that path that have directed that person to do that? The hurt, the wound, everything that is behind, let's say, the scene. In other words, what I see is a lack of an awareness about more sound anthropology, a more personalist anthropology. In other words, the person is not just will or intellect, it's also emotion, it's psyche. And so even though in America we are swamped by emotivism feeling, when we come to this situation, we say, well, people have chosen, as if the will is completely devoid of emotion. And my question to this is, I have observed this curious description, but my question is, how then one, as a teacher or an activist of a militant of the Christian Solidarity Party, propose what you are proposing, Professor? In other words, how then we educate people and educate ourselves and seeing in this human being more than someone who commit a violent crime?
That's a wonderful question. And what you've said just now resonated with me in a number of different ways. And I want to pick up on one of them, which is responsive to the question you just asked. I think that is, in my experience, a starting point for getting people to reconsider their assumptions about people who have been in prison, people who have committed violent acts, is to help them identify with those people and to see themselves reflected in those people. And one way of doing that is to remind people or to inform people that that most individuals who commit what are classified as crimes are not in prison. What do I mean by that? A very small percentage of people who commit harm or violence, even those acts of harm and violence that are covered by criminal statute, end up serving time. And there are many, many reasons for that. For example, the clearance rate, which is to say the rate at which the particular crimes are solved for murder, and the clearance rate for murder is among the highest for all crimes, is about 60%. So about 60% of murders get solved throughout the United States, and it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Most people most murders are not solved, which by implication, almost half of the murders are not solved. So by implication, almost half the people who kill other people don't end up in prison or don't end up in a court or don't end up even being arrested. And the same is true is definitely true of domestic battery, for example, of assault, of sexual violence, and of so many other acts of harm and crime. And in fact, there's been some research that suggests over half of American adults have at some point committed an act which is classified as a crime, and that a good many have committed more than one. The difference between people who are serving time in prison and those of us who have, and I've never been incarcerated, those of us who have been fortunate enough not to serve time in prison, isn't the degree of evil or hard-heartedness that is in our spirit or our soul. It's due to fortune and to privilege and to access to resources, and to many other things, many of which are beyond our control and have nothing to do with how wonderful or how good we are. And I find that when I encourage my students, for example, I teach a course called History of the Prison, and we do some exercise in which I encourage them to think about their own wrongdoing, frankly. I don't ask them to reveal it, but encouraging them to think about what things they have done. And these are relatively young people. They haven't had that much time to do that much that's wrong. But many of us have done things that we are ashamed of, or that we could be arrested for, if anyone else knew about it. That's a way to that discussion is a way to opening up perhaps the hearts of others to consider that those that are behind bars may not be so different, except perhaps in race and class demographics, from those of us who are not. And the sort of, anyway, that's one way of I think, and addressing the question that you put to me of how can we encourage people to consider other approaches to crime and to harm.
Christopher, comments on this look for the lumber in your own eye first point that Professor Ginsburg is raising.
Yeah, I think that what she says is right. I suppose I would defend the notion of crime in this way, is that the government, the state, has to define certain acts as unacceptable under law, because the state just can't go around policing people without the sanction of law. So the whole point of crime, designating something as crime, is to show that the state claims jurisdiction over that. Now, that's always going to be imperfect, and sometimes, in some cases, extremely highly imperfect. But I don't know if I would object to the whole notion of designating certain wrong acts, right, we could even call sinful acts perhaps, as crimes. I guess the question I would have is, for instance, like I think of like somebody who's a pedophile. We should, if someone's come out and has been in prison for being a pedophile, we have to do everything we possibly can to try to integrate that person in. But there's going to be certain restrictions on their actions. For instance, I, as a father, I wouldn't necessarily let my son go camping with somebody who's been convicted for pedophilia. I mean, that might be considered rejection, but it also strikes me as being prudent. And there are certain prudent reactions, it would seem, that one needs to take in regards to people who have done certain things. And I'm thinking people who are just violent. How do we deal with that? It doesn't seem the restorative fabric can really address that in terms of protecting society against people who do such acts.
Sure, that's a thoughtful question. Niels Christie is the philosopher, and he's based in somewhere in Northern Europe, and I think he's passed, who challenged me most on the concept of crime. And he's even more radical than I am. So that's a good source for delving into that more.
You want to give us that name again, Rebecca?
Sure. And I think it's Christie. I think it's CHRISTIE.
All right.
But I'll also email you because he might be Norwegian and there might be a strange, unusual to me spelling in there. So the phrase "people who are violent," that's something I want us to reconsider. There aren't people who are violent. There are people who have done violent acts, who have committed violent acts. And in fact, the research is really, really clear on this point that most people who commit violent acts commit one violent act. Most people who kill once, as opposed to people who shoplift might shoplift every day. But most people who kill once. And they often kill clearly in very particular circumstances of aroused emotion or great stress, whatever the case is. There's a need to, again, separate the person in their wholeness and their complexity, in their pain, from the act that they committed, that grew out of that complexity and that pain. And this is one of those places, I think, where science and data will help us to provide, to institute processes that will have the function of assuring our safety and be prudent, because the science that's out there and the data that's out there suggests that we don't have as much to fear from people who committed violent acts as we might think we do, or as we might fear that we do. But I'd also want to get back to the point of the pedophile, which is to say an adult who has been convicted of what we consider to be inappropriate sexual relations with a minor child, because wow, what a great example and what a can of worms. I have two young daughters, and I'm also not going to, and our house is open to a lot of people, but I'm not going to, including people who've been convicted of sexual offenses, but I'm not going to let my daughters go on a camping trip with somebody who has been convicted of a sexual offense either. But I think prohibiting the camping trip is on another end of the scale than rejecting them from church, for example, or not renting an apartment to them, or not giving them a job. I also think that raising the question of that sort of behavior gets us to area, a realm that I'm not very comfortable in, just because I'm not very knowledgeable, but of behavior that is based not in choices, but in psychology. It does seem to be the case that much of that behavior, what we deem to be sexually inappropriate behavior between adults and minors, the adults that commit it have a hard time stopping themselves, and that it is based biologically, psychologically, in parts of the human that we don't yet have a good grasp on. So we need to learn more. We need to become better at supporting people who cannot help but to behave as they are in the habit of behaving, and to stop seeing that behavior as criminal or willful, and to understand it through other lenses.
Sobering things. Two thoughts, and then I'll ask Mario and Christopher, and of course you, Rebecca, for your last thoughts, and then we ought to wind things up for today, at least. The first thought is this. You say, and I've said the same sort of thing very often myself, that you're not ready to speak about certain things because you don't think you know enough about them, or you're hesitant. You will speak about things, but you do so in a hesitant way because you don't know enough about them. I think the human condition is such that we can know a great deal about something, an enormous amount about something, perhaps not through academic research, but we can know a great deal about something and still be hesitant to speak of it because there's a demonic force at work. Put it in different ways. There's the reality of evil at work, and sometimes we're just stunned by it, just stunned. And I think there's a certain view that people have, and maybe academics are more inclined to have it, that with enough education, everything will go away, every bad thing will go away, but that goes right back to the classics. You can't teach virtue, and yet vice is as real as it can be. There's that thought. Another thought, in the Solidarity Party, we believe in pro-life for the whole of life. So let's take two instances. Right now, the nuclear détente is falling apart and falling faster and faster, and nuclear stockpiling is growing, and I suspect the great majority of people in the United States would say that's regrettable, but what can we do about it? And the idea is life is such that sometimes we have to threaten to kill innocent people. Maybe it'd be wrong to kill them. All right, it'd be wrong to kill them, but we've got to be able to threaten seriously to kill them. Well, I think that kind of posture cripples the country with regard to any concern about nonviolence. And then whole life for the pro-life for the whole of life. Since Roe versus Wade, we've had well over 60 million abortions. And having been in front of a lot of abortion mills for many, many hours, I know that lots of times women go in weeping, and the men with them, if they've decided to show up at all, are strongly encouraging them to go into the abortuary. And I know one case, at least, in which a child was adopted. And how did it come to happen? The woman was encouraged to go into the abortuary, and she went in and she went out the back door, and she said, "Thank God you're here," and that baby was saved. Now, what do we say about terms criminalize, decriminalize? I think that we in the party want to be very, very careful about any kind of what should I say? Any kind of criminal punishment directed at women. At the same time, I think we ought not to hesitate for a minute to restrict doctors who make their living by killing unborn babies. We just recently had, in the area of South Bend, mind you, 2,100 discovered killed unborn babies that an abortionist had kept. God only knows why.
Kept?
So this is massive wrongdoing and terrible difficulties in figuring out how to redress it. So those are my two thoughts. Now, Mario, Christopher, do you have any last words for this round? We'll get Professor Ginsburg back for sure. Everybody we talk to, we say, we're going to get you back for sure. And somehow contact is lost. No, yes, Mario, Christopher.
Well, just quickly, I guess more of an observation, something to maybe explore. I certainly agree that how one has been treated, one's emotional reactions really, at least might say, mitigate culpability of any particular act, and sometimes even erase it. Though I would want to say this is that if we take a dog, for instance, and a dog has been mistreated, it can become a dog that one cannot keep in one's family just because of past treatment, cruel treatment. Some happen with human beings when they're treated cruelly, but I would think that there's a difference, and unless we want to deny the will, that's the difference. There's a way a human being can rise above even his own reactions. Now, some people I could see in cases where some people can't rise above that, but I'm not sure if it's in every case. So even if there is strong emotional pull towards doing certain acts, which is sort of the kind of the definition of vice or viciousness in someone, there's still the aspect of the will that makes us different than, say, a beast, for instance, who has been treated cruelly. And I think that's the difficulty in trying to, at least my difficulty in trying to wrap my mind around some of the things you've said and how we actually balance those things out in terms of how we react, what we do in the face of acts which are, if you want to call them antisocial, if you want to call them sinful, if you want to call them something else, but which we accept as unacceptable behavior. So that's basically my observation on that.
Now, Mario, are you with us, or have you run off to class? He's run off to class. You know how teachers are. Okay, Professor Ginsburg, your final thoughts.
Thank you. I'll just say a couple of things. First, another thank you. This has been wonderful. I've very, very much enjoyed the conversation and appreciated the smart questions and the responses. It's been such a pleasure. I do a lot of interviews, and sometimes I get tired of being asked questions like, why would you educate somebody who is in prison, or what's the value of higher education? And I'm glad we didn't have to go down that road. And in fact, had a very challenging conversation for me, and many of these points that were raised I'm going to pick up on and think about and research further. Jim, I'm really challenged by your comment about evil, because my own orientation is that there is no such thing. So I think that's probably 5 years worth of conversation, but I want to think about that a little bit further, because that does throw a spanner in the works of
well, mind you, it's no independent standing thing. I take evil to be a distortion of something good.
Oh, okay. Well, okay.
If you were to list the real things that existed in the universe on their own, as it were, you wouldn't find evil on the list. But we use evil, and we can use it best if we understand it in terms of a distortion, a twistedness of that which is good. But that's in passing.
Oh, thanks for that. And the second, Christopher, I found this comment really juicy and deserving of a lot more time. To restorative and transformative practices, I don't think I did a very good job of emphasizing the fact that they are not without a level of accountability. It's not the case that somebody subject to a restorative justice practice, for example, is let off with impunity, or has no, that there are no consequences. It's typically the case, and there are some restorative justice practices, there are some restorative justice instances in which restorative justice practices resulted in what we would think of traditionally as punishment. The parties involved came to a consensus that that was the appropriate response. The way it differs, and this is important, from a traditional court process is that everyone had a chance to be heard. It was a result that everybody contributed to, but the end was something that looked a lot like what we would call punishment. That's not ideal in my book, but that's the beauty of the restorative process, right? It's not up to me. It's up to the people who are involved. But the main point is that it doesn't mean that there are no consequences, that there is no accountability. In fact, what I've heard many people who have been involved with restorative justice processes say that they like about it is that there's more opportunity for accountability, more opportunity for people who have hurt others to be required to acknowledge the hurt, and in fact to face the fact that they have hurt and caused pain and suffering. And yet, in acknowledging that, in coming to face with that, there is no inherent requirement that they themselves be subject to pain and suffering. And that's great for another conversation.
Yes, and there will be more. We always end with the gospel reading from the liturgy of the day. And the gospel for today is taken from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee into the district of the Decapolis. And people brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment and begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him off by himself away from the crowd. He put his finger into the man's ears and, spitting, touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. He ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished and said, He has done all things well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.